I'm delighted to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Meiko O'Halloran. She completed her undergraduate degree at UCL and then went on to complete her doctoral and master's work at Oxford University. Since 2006, she has been teaching at Newcastle University and is currently a senior lecturer in Romantic literature. She is the author of James Hogg and British Romanticism and is currently working on a book on Keats. Please welcome Dr. Meiko O'Halloran. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and thank you very much, Kay, for inviting me to be part of your programme. I've been enjoying the events myself as an attendee, and it's really lovely to be presenting this evening. And thank you everyone for coming. Moving on up, Keats's epic ambitions is my topic this evening. In June 1818, the London-based poet John Keats and his friend Charles Brown left London for a walking tour of North Britain. This was an adventure that they anticipated would last 4 months, starting in Lancaster and taking them all the way to the Scottish Highlands. Keats was then 22 years old, and having completed his medical training as an apothecary and surgeon at Guy's Hospital in London 2 years earlier, he had recently decided to pursue a career as a poet instead of a medical practitioner. So here we have Keats listening to a nightingale on Hampstead Heath. So he starts from London and actually starts his walking tour though from Lancaster. Let me tell you a little bit about his friend Charles Brown. So his friend Brown had grown up in Lambeth in South London and worked in Russia for several years in his youth. He had a career in business, but he had now inherited some money and had begun a life of literary leisure at the age of 31. Brown and Keats had met and become friends in 1817 when they were both living in Hampstead. And I should say that Hampstead was not then the incredibly affluent area in London that it is today. Keats was living with his youngest brother, Tom, at Wellwalk, and Brown was living a few streets away at Wentworth Place, pictured here, this beautiful white house, which is now today open to the public as Keats House. The two friends decided to embark on a shared journey of discovery and aspiration on foot, partly to enjoy some literary tourism and also to explore places of natural beauty. And to put this journey into context, I've borrowed a map from Nicholas Rowe's wonderful biography of Keats, in which I hope you can see that all the places, so this sort of notes the places that Keats had previously visited before he goes north. And all of those places are in the south of England. So his tour to the Lake District and Scotland really dramatically changes the picture of Keats's life experience. Keats couldn't afford to go on a grand tour of Europe like some of his contemporaries, so he had to look closer to home for the materials to stimulate his imagination. And his journey to the Lake District and Scotland does bear a lot of fruit in his poetry. So when he returned from this journey, he had the most productive year of his poetic life. He composed practically all the poems that he's kind of now most famous for, including the great odes and his two epic fragments, the Hyperion poems, which all appear in his final collection of poems of 1820. I've also included another map here, and I apologise that it's not better quality, but it gives you, I hope, a sort of a sense of how much ground Keats and Brown cover on their journey. They so they cover about, I think it's 600 miles in all, going from the mountains of Cumberland and Westmoreland across the Scottish border. They go into Burns's country to Dumfries, and Alloway, and then they hop over to the east coast of Northern Ireland briefly, but I'm sorry to say that they did not get on so well in Ireland, and so they hurried back and they continued up the Hebrides, visiting Iona, Mull and Staffa. And their journey culminates at Ben Nevis. So they climb Ben Nevis, after which sadly Keats becomes too ill to continue much further, and he's forced to return home early. So Keats and Brown part at Inverness, and Keats catches a passage boat back to London. So in the event, they had expected this journey to be 4 months, but in the event it's only 6 weeks. And during these 6 weeks, the two friends walk sometimes for up to 30 miles a day, capturing their thoughts and impressions en route. So Keats writes a series of very lively letters to his close friends and family on the journey, and Brown kept a travel notebook, which he later published as Walks in the North in 1840. Now, Keats saw this expedition as absolutely integral to his poetic development. The combination of direct empirical experience, new sensory impressions, and vigorous physical challenges would, he felt, sharpen his vision and make him a better poet. When they reached Inverary on the 18th of July, Keats reflected on the purpose of the journey in a letter to his friend Benjamin Bailey. I should not have consented to myself these 4 months tramping in the Highlands, but that I thought it would give me more experience, rub off more prejudice, use me to more hardship, identify finer scenes, load me with grander mountains, and strengthen more my reach in poetry than would stopping at home among books, even though I should reach Homer. For Keats, every aspect of the journey north was about extending his poetic powers with the immediacy of new experiences and scenes that would stretch his imagination beyond the reading of books. Keats hoped that the new insights gained through his travels would in turn help him to claim a more esteemed place as a poet. He wanted to be taken seriously and respected. Even at the tender age of 22, he aspired to compose a poetry that was mature and that might raise his contemporary readers' view of him and his position in the British literary marketplace. As critics like Fiona Stafford have explored, the Northern Walking Tour played a critical part in Keats's efforts to free himself from the restrictions of his perceived place in a Cockney school of poetry led by his friend Leigh Hunt. Leigh Hunt and Keats were both dismissed by critics as Cockney poets and seen as part of an aspiring lower social class of Londoners. So the journey north is very much bound up for Keats with his desire both to move up the ladder in terms of the kind of contemporary poetic scene, and also to prove his right to join a kind of future poetic canon. So this talk considers the significance of this Northern Walking Tour at this pivotal moment in Keats's career as he looks back to his poetic forefathers and forward in his efforts to earn his place for posterity. Now, part of the reason that it's a very pivotal moment in Keats's career is that Keats very much sort of believes in the neoclassical genre system, whereby you start your apprenticeship in poetry by composing pastoral poems, and then you would work your way up to the kind of highest genre of the epic. So if you really wanted to make your name as a poet, you would write an epic poem that would last, as Homer, Virgil, Dante and Milton had done, and as Lord Byron would do in his Don Juan, though that's mock epic, and as Wordsworth was doing in his Prelude and the Excursion. Now, so far, Keats had written several pastoral poems, including Sleep and Poetry, which was published in his first collection of poems of 1817. And Endymion, a long poem about a young shepherd boy who falls in love with the moon, which had just been published a few months earlier in April 1818. On his walk north, Keats was looking physically and metaphorically towards the landscape of the epic. He was in search of a kind of grander aesthetic and a more challenging subject matter than he had tackled before. And in his knapsack, he carried a tiny copy of Henry Francis Carey's translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, The Vision, from 1814. So Keats is very much imaginatively exploring a kind of vast topography as a reader, even as he's stretching his imagination and his limbs on this walking tour. And he's aspiring to create an epic poem of his own in future. The letters and poems that he sent to his friends and family during the trip are especially revealing about his heightened consciousness of himself as a poet and his growing aspirations and his self-positioning among other poets, as well as his responses to particular places. So the rest of my talk is structured in 3 parts. I'm going to take us to Wordsworth country, to the Lake District, and then we'll move into Keats's experience of Robert Burns's country in Alloway. And thirdly, we'll consider Keats at Fingals Cave in the Scottish Hebrides, before concluding at Ben Nevis. So let's turn our attention to the Lake District now. Keats's frame of reference was necessarily restricted to the relatively small number of places that he had visited outside London. And as they journeyed into the Lake District, he instinctively compared it to the south of England. He remarked that Devon had nothing comparable to the mountains in the clouds of the Lake District. But if the geographical circumference of Keats's experience was comparatively modest, what quickly struck him in the early stages of the trip was the detail and depth and character of the places that they visited, the visual and textual features that he hadn't anticipated from his reading. The travellers set off energetically at 4 a.m. on the 25th of June, 1818, in a Scotch mist, as Keats put it. So they walked 17 miles from Lancaster to Enmore before breakfast on the first day, a long way. And then they proceed from Kendal to Bowness the next day. We're looking here at an image of Lake Windermere, and the beauty of Lake Windermere and its surroundings made an immediate impression on Keats. He declared dramatically, "There is no such thing as time and space, which, by the way, came forcibly upon me on seeing for the first hour the lake and mountains of Winander. I cannot describe them. They surpass my expectation. Beautiful water, shores and islands green to the marge, mountains all round up to the clouds." So we can sense his immense excitement from the very first day. Brown was also struck by the ways in which their removal from London had created the mental and physical space for appreciating the natural world. After reporting Keats's opinion that looking at mountains and lake must bring conviction that there is a God, Brown goes on to say that although the delicacy of a single blade of grass, its formation, its life, its growth, might in its own way be impressive, the majestic mountains around them inspired absolute veneration. As Brown puts it, the spirit was bowed in reverence. However, their delight in the natural splendour and sanctity of the place jostles against their aversion to the pressures that were being brought to bear on the region from Regency tourism. Far from escaping to a tranquil rural idyll of the kind that Keats had perhaps imagined in his pastoral poems, everywhere they went, they saw the grotesque pretensions and trivial preoccupations of metropolitan life permeating the natural scene. So we come across passages such as this in his letter to his brother Tom, in which Keats's eloquent reaction to the beauty of Windermere is juxtaposed with his resentment of the intrusion of other tourists. And I might add that there is, of course, a kind of irony here, because Keats himself is a tourist, but crucially for Keats, the people he encounters are the wrong kind of tourists, because they are fashionable people who are not as sensitive and appreciative of nature as he is. He extols the noble tenderness of the views of Lake Windermere, which, as he says, make one forget the divisions of life, age, youth, poverty, and riches, and refine one's sensual vision into a sort of North Star, which can never cease to be open-lidded and steadfast over the wonders of the great power. In the same passage, though, he recoils from the many disfigurements of the lake caused by the miasma of London. In Keats's eyes, it was not just that Windermere was contaminated with bucks and soldiers and women of fashion whose hat-band ignorance he despised. I love that phrase of his, hat-band ignorance. As he goes on to observe, even the border inhabitants seemed out of step with the romance of their surroundings from their continual intercourse with London rank and fashion. If Keats was expecting, perhaps somewhat naively, to find unassuming rural innocence, what he saw instead was the marring influence of the city, which even seemed to disrupt the local community's connection to its habitat. So, however much one might feel startled into forgetting the divisions of life, to take up that phrase of Keats's, and inspired to admire a higher power while gazing at the magnificence of the natural world, the tedious social role-playing and reinforcement of rigid social class structures of Regency England seemed to continue around them. Although they sought to focus on enjoying glimpses of the wooded shores and islands of the lake, the thick smog of fashionable London tourists seemed to obtrude on their vision, polluting the ethereal beauty of the place. It's clear from Keats's early letters on the trip that the Lake District was for him inextricably bound up with the poetry of William Wordsworth, and this part of their journey was certainly planned with a visit to Wordsworth in mind. One of the first things that Keats does when they arrive in Bowness is to ask a waiter at an inn where they dine about Wordsworth, and he receives a disconcerting report of the older poet's political activity in the area. So in the summer of 1818, everyone was getting ready for a general election, and Keats and Brown found this area kind of abuzz with campaigns for local MPs, and learnt that Wordsworth is involved in this as well. Wordsworth had been there a few days earlier, he learnt, canvassing for William Lowther, the Tory candidate who was subsequently elected MP for Westmoreland. This news was all the more disappointing for Keats because Lowther's rival in the election was the popular Whig candidate Henry Brougham, known for his reformist principles and his liberal ideals. Brougham had defended the Hunt brothers in their trial for seditious libel in 1811 and had since become a friend to the Hunt circle of which Keats was part. Although Keats was well aware of Wordsworth's changed political views, It was disturbing to him to find an author who had once used his poetic voice to bring into view the lives and stories of those on the margins of society in his lyrical ballads, now using his poetic prestige to campaign for the continued security of a powerful family of Tories. Keats sounds both startled and grieved when he writes to his younger brother Tom of Wordsworth's electioneering. What think you of that? Wordsworth versus Broome. Sad, sad, sad. And yet the family has been his friend always. What can we say? While his admiration for Wordsworth's poetry remained steadfast, the distance between them on matters of social reform struck Keats forcibly. The radicalism of Wordsworth's youth seemed to have faded from view, leaving a bastion of the establishment in his place. And interestingly, this seems to shape Keats's view of the poet's home, Rydal Mount, where Wordsworth had moved in 1813. The ground that Wordsworth now chose to occupy personally as well as politically appeared to emphasise the differences between the poets still further. Given his own antipathy to the congestion of well-to-do London tourists, Keats was struck to see that the author of The Excursion, who described himself in the preface as having retired to his native mountains and taken as the subject of his major project, The Recluse, had in fact chosen a very prominent location. Instead of being in retirement, he has himself and his house full in the thick of fashionable visitors, quite convenient to be pointed at all the summer long, Keats observed. Far from removing himself from the social spectacle and frippery of city life, it was as if Wordsworth had welcomed the miasma of London into his home and made himself part of its display. Nevertheless, there's a very strong sense of Keats's eager anticipation as they draw close to Wordsworth's home and locality. We slept at Ambleside, not above 2 miles from Rydal and the residence of Wordsworth, he wrote. They rose at 6 in the morning on that day and set aside, on this day that they had set aside as a day of rest. Yes, so they allow themselves 2 hours extra sleep that day, and they go and call on Wordsworth. But the hoped for meeting with Wordsworth was not to be. Now, Keats had admired Wordsworth for a very long time, and he thought Wordsworth's epic poem, The Excursion, was, along with Benjamin Haydon's paintings and William Hazlitt's depth of taste, one of the 3 things to rejoice at in this age. So he's really a great admirer of Wordsworth. And there had been some further developments in Keats's own poetic thought and understanding that suggested to him that he and Wordsworth were pursuing the same path as poets. So having sent Wordsworth a personally inscribed copy of his poems through their friend Haydon the year before, Keats had been excited to meet Wordsworth several times in London between late December in 1817 and January 1818. He had been contemplating Wordsworth's poetic genius very carefully just a few weeks before setting off for the north. Writing to J.H. Reynolds on the 3rd of May of 1818, Keats offers a simile of human life in which he measures his philosophical progress and perception against that of Wordsworth. You'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to read this long passage, but I'm putting it on the screen because this is Keats in one of his letters a few weeks before setting off for the Lake District, comparing life to a mansion of many apartments. And here he describes how having progressed from an infant or thoughtless chamber where we remain as long as we do not think, in life we then progress to a chamber of maiden thought where we see nothing but pleasant wonders, and then we move into a phase where we see and become aware of pain. and misery and heartbreak. And at this point, we see lots of dark passages in this kind of figurative house that represents life. Now, Keats sees Wordsworth as having reached this point of seeing these sort of dark passages in his poetry when he composed his Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. And so as Keats thinks about Wordsworth's genius, at the end of this passage, he says, you know, he is a genius and superior to us insofar as he can, more than we, make discoveries and shed a light in them. So Keats feels that he's on a path like Wordsworth, and that he wants to explore these kind of dark passages of life. He wants to confront misery, heartbreak, pain, sickness, oppression, and kind of grapple with those questions. So their next visit he thought would be very momentous, but Wordsworth is out. Keats was much disappointed to find that Wordsworth and his family were absent when they visited Rydal Mount on the morning of the 27th of June. I wrote a note for him and stuck it up over what I knew must be Miss Wordsworth's portrait, and set forth again. And his disappointment is perhaps compounded by hearing that Wordsworth was away that day because he's doing more election campaigning for the Lowthers. Now, sorry, I'm going to bring up our next image. So 2 days later, remembering the sights that they went on to enjoy as they walked by Rydal Water and through Grasmere Vale after this missed meeting, Keats no longer thinks of how Wordsworth was seen, but of the poet's own domestic view. And he recalls that Wordsworth House is situated just on the rise of the foot of Mount Rydal. His parlour window looks directly down Winandermere. And he recalls some lines from Wordsworth's poems, the ancient woman seated on Helm Crag, which is a line from Wordsworth's On the Naming of Places. So this act of kind of sharing Wordsworth's daily views, walking in the area that Wordsworth sort of enjoys on a daily basis, and recalling lines of his poetry, I think can only have encouraged Keats to intensify his focus on the kind of startling natural beauty around them. And it was Wordsworth, after all, who had in his poem, one of his poems in Lyrical Ballads, urged readers to put aside their books and learn from the impulse of a vernal wood, to come forth into the light of things, let nature be your teacher. So we're now looking at an image of Stock Gill Force in Ambleside, and this makes a huge impression on Keats, this site. Most memorably, Keats's letters from the Lake District brim with excitement about the profound sense of surprise, vitality, and sustenance that he feels from observing the exquisite features of a landscape in close proximity. On seeing a waterfall for the first time at Ambleside, I think I've got a quotation here, he enthused. What astonishes me more than anything is the tone, the colouring, the slate, the stone, the moss, the rockweed, or if I may so say, the intellect, the countenance of such places. The space, the magnitude of mountains and waterfalls are well imagined before one sees them, but this countenance or intellectual tone must surpass every imagination and defy any remembrance. To understand the countenance of places was to appreciate their detail and character in a way that felt invigorating to Keats. However fleeting the experience and however impossible to recapture perfectly in one's memory. Here he felt able to claim the landscape as a source of poetic inspiration and learning. I shall learn poetry here and shall henceforth write more than ever for the abstract endeavour of being able to add a mite to that massive beauty which is harvested from these grand materials by the finest spirits and put into ethereal existence for the relish of one's fellows. There's a sense on this journey of Keats affirming his understanding of himself as a poet, not simply by inheriting the work of his poetic forebears, but by learning and in some sense kind of earning his craft through an apprenticeship, by effacing his preconceptions, expanding his senses, and beginning to see the world anew. I live in the eye, he continues, and my imagination surpassed is at rest. So as one might expect of a trained surgeon and apothecary, the perfection of his professional skills was very fundamental to Keats's understanding of the process of pursuing a poetic vocation. But in order to realise the abstract endeavour of contributing something so mysterious to human experience as beauty in poetry, he feels that his path must be self-directed. So in the next part, we are going to follow in the footsteps of Robert Burns. Because one of the major highlights of, to which Keats looks forward as they journey into Scotland is visiting the Bardies country, Burns's native Ayrshire. The approach to Ayr, which Keats describes as richly meadowed, wooded, heathed and rivuleted, with a grand sea view terminated by the Black Mountains of the Isle of Arran, impressed him with a sense of creative possibility and reminded him of his own poetic ambitions. As soon as I saw them so nearly, I said to myself, how is it they did not beckon Burns to some great attempt at epic? Arriving in Ayr on the 11th of July, he and Brown were delighted by the feeling of stepping into a landscape that they recognised immediately from their reading of Burns's poetry. We came down upon everything suddenly. There were in our way the bonny Doon with the brig that Tam O'Shanter crossed, Kirk Alloway, Burns's cottage, and then the brigs of Ayr. However, when they arrived at Burns's cottage, instead of feeling a rightful sense of homecoming as a poetic son of Burns, Keats was shocked to find a viper in the nest. He grew angry and disillusioned after meeting the present keeper of the house, whom he describes as a drunken old jackass whose presence seemed to make a mockery of the sacredness of Burns's genius and his birthplace. The old rascal boasted of having been Burns's drinking companion. And the encounter with this, Keats is very, very indignant, as you can tell, and he also describes him as a flat old dog. So his encounter with this flat old dog, who Keats sort of declares should be kicked for having spoken to Burns, seems to bring the grim realities of the great bard's life into depressing proximity. This poet's house filled Keats with gloom and despair. His misery is a dead weight upon the nimbleness of one's quill. I tried to forget it, to drink toddy without a care, to write a merry sonnet. It won't do. He talked with bitches, he drank with blackguards. He was miserable. We can see horribly clear in the works of such a man, his whole life, as if we were God's spies. If Keats had been disturbed by the distance between himself and Wordsworth in their politics during his visit to Cumbria and Westmoreland, he seems to have felt nauseous as he confronted the fate that he might share with Burns of living and dying in conditions of wretched depression and poverty. As a poet of humble birth and labouring class origins, Burns had provided an inspiring model of an original talent so brilliant and powerful that it had prevailed against the odds, enabling him to become Scotland's national poet in his lifetime and strengthening his fame after his death. But whatever Burns's triumphs, Keats now saw that he had lived in distress. And this is the poem, This Mortal Body of 1,000 Days, that Keats writes at Burns's cottage, and he thinks that it's such a trashy poem. He feels so uninspired as he's writing it that he actually destroys the poem. But thanks to Charles Brown, we still have it. Keats, I think, seems to feel the kind of the dead weight of Burns's misery so acutely, and feel that he sees into the bard's life so clearly, because they seem to reflect his fears about his own fate. So the sonnet that he composed in Burns's room, this mortal body of 1,000 days, concludes with this darkly ironic realization at the end that this is fame, you know, having your birthplace turned into a tourist trap. And of course, Keats is a young poet who's in quest of fame himself, and full of hope and fear. Now, just as he had lamented Wordsworth's support for the Lowthers and sort of said, sad, 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 so he responds to what he calls the flummery of the birthplace, Burns's birthplace, with cant, cant, cant. It is enough to give a spirit the guts ache. So Burns had disappeared into his grave 22 summers earlier, but Keats reacts with kind of raw anger and feeling at seeing the hardship of the poet's life and the spectacle of his childhood home emptied of its integrity. So there are invigorating and joyful moments on the tour, and we're coming to another one shortly. But there are also very serious and oppressive moments at which Keats feels that great poetry is sort of indelibly associated with great suffering. And Keats knows that he must confront suffering himself as a poet in order to kind of develop his sort of poetic maturity. So he goes on to explore the kind of profound emotional effects of loss and suffering in the epic poem that he begins composing later that year. And it's his visit to Fingals Cave that suggests the vast topography and the Titan figures who then become the focus of the poem. Although Keats and Brown had set out to travel for several months, in the event their visit to Fingals Cave on the Isle of Staffa proves to be the culmination of the poetic pilgrimage that had already taken them to the homes of Wordsworth and Burns. Their experience of seeing and exploring this extraordinary place was perhaps all the more precious for the physical hardship that they endured to get there. So unlike the sophisticated Regency tourists whose pleasure boats and barouches they had seen at Loch Lomond, they travelled as cheaply as possible. After 2 ferry crossings to reach the Isle of Mull, they clambered between dreary mountains, Keats says, over bog and rock and river with our breeches tucked up and our stockings in hand. They slept in their clothes in a shepherd's hut at the foot of Glen Moor on the night of the 22nd of July, before undertaking what Keats calls a most wretched walk of 37 miles across Mull the next day, and then they travel by boat to Iona. And on Mull, Keats catches the cold that then forces him to return to London in a feverish state 2 weeks later. But his letter journal to Tom on the 26th of July describes Fingals Cave and includes the first, that letter sort of also includes the first mention of his sore throat. But the visit to Staffa is very positive and productive in allowing Keats to see this kind of formidable otherworldly landscape and this kind of sheer gigantism, which is unlike anything that Keats had imagined before. And in 1818, no visitors could be ignorant of the literary associations with Fingals Cave and Celtic mythology that James McPherson had based his Ossianic poetry of the 1760s on. So it's probably hard for us to imagine this today because lots of people have not heard of Ossian or McPherson. but the publication of McPherson's Fragments of Ancient Poetry caused an absolute sensation in the cultural imagination of late 18th century Britain. And what was so exciting was that McPherson presented himself as the translator of an ancient native Scottish epic poem from the 3rd century that had been composed in Gaelic by Ossian, who is a kind of Highland Homer figure who recalls the kind of highest ideals of ancient Celtic heroism epitomised by his father Fingal. And what's so tantalising also is that they're fragments, so they're incomplete, and so the imagination has much more room to kind of fill those spaces in between. But McPherson sees that he's onto a very good thing and publishes some, or he manages to find, discover and translate some complete epic poems to build on this success, Tamora and Fingal. And it turns out that McPherson has composed them all himself. As they approached Stafford by boat and Keats saw the basalt pillars emerging from the billowing waves, he knew that this was the landscape of both an ancient and a modern epic world. His excitement upon arriving at this remarkable place is clear both in his prose description and the poem that he composes about Fingals Cave in his letter to Tom. As he gazed at the huge natural edifice, gigantic figures from Greek mythology seemed to spring into life as the imagined makers of this mysterious place. The finest thing is Fingals Cave. It is entirely a hollowing out of basalt pillars. Suppose now the giants who rebelled against Jove had taken a whole mass of black columns and bound them together like bunches of matches, and then with immense axes had made a cavern in the body of these columns. To Keats's eyes, the enormous scale of the cave suggested a feat of collective Titan strength, rather than a single Celtic warrior's greatness. Each rough-hewn column was so vast, he remarked, that about the island you might seat an army of men, each on a pillar. Now, this wonderfully whimsical poem that Keats composed about the visit, Not a Ladin Magian, is also preoccupied with the question of who created Fingals Cave, this rugged wonder. And it's striking to me that Keats doesn't sort of respond to a kind of with an Ossianic homage, but he's thinking about another poet occupying his thoughts. Inside the cave, the speaker of the poem finds a sleeping figure. As I stood its roofing under, lo, I saw one sleeping there, on the marble cold and bare, while the surges washed his feet, and his garments white did beat, drenched about the sombre rocks. On his neck his well-grown locks, lifted dry above the mane, were upon the curl again. What is this, and what art thou? Whispered I, and touched his brow. What art thou, and what is this? Whispered I, and strove to kiss his eyes. Awakened by the tender fraternal address, the sleeper starts up and reveals his identity. I am Lycidas, said he, famed in funeral minstrelsy. With the joyful ease of an unbidden dream or vision, Keats presents himself finding the long-lost Lycidas of Milton's pastoral elegy. The young poet who Milton had lost nearly 200 years earlier, Keats has found asleep on the shores of Stafford, apparently washed up by the Hebridean Sea, which Milton had imagined carrying the remains of his friend. In Milton's elegy, the poet is tormented by fears about where Lycidas's body now lies. The elegy was for his friend Edward King, who had drowned at the age of 25 when his ship sank in the Irish Sea off the coast of Wales in August 1637, and his body was never found. In his imaginative response, Keats takes his cue from Milton's heartfelt invocation, and implies that the dolphins have kind of carried the body to Fingals Cave through their service to Oceanus, the author of this formidable place. This was architected thus by the great Oceanus. Here his mighty waters play hollow organs all the day. Here by turns his dolphins all, finny palmers great and small, come to pay devotion due, each a mouth of pearls must strew. Emphasizing the sacredness of the place, Keats's Lycidas goes on to explain in the poem that he has served as the pontiff priest of this cathedral of the sea, Fingals Cave, and that his efforts are directed to preserving the magic of the place from prying eyes. Keats's response to Milton's Lycidas in this poem and in this moment in his career seems to be bound up with making the momentous transition from the apprenticeship mode of the pastoral to the highest form of the epic. Milton's pastoral elegy speaks precisely to the situation of a poet who must find a new key in which to sing. In addition to the personal sorrow of having lost his much-loved friend, Milton confronts his own untimely summoning, and he reluctantly takes up laurels which are not yet matured, composing an elegy that he feels that he is too green a poet to attempt. As the closing lines of Milton's Lycidas look forward tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new, so Keats's poem about finding Lycidas also seems to indicate a readiness to progress to new poetic realms. With a proactive leap, Lycidas disappears into the sea. So saying with a spirit's glance, he dived. The unfinished line leaves us uncertain whether he will resurface on another island or never reappear. Brown remarked that he never could get Keats to finish the poem. But the physical peak of the journey was still to come. And we're moving to the last phase now. On the 3rd of August, Keats wrote proudly to Tom that they had climbed Ben Nevis, the highest mountain in Great Britain, the day before. At the summit, the mist was so thick that everything they looked at, including the tremendous gaping chasms that had appeared as great rents in the very heart of the mountain on their way up, now seemed shrouded from view. Keats composes a sonnet on the mountain, and he begins it with this line: "Read me a lesson, muse, and speak it loud upon the top of Nevis, blind in mist." So even here he's seeking poetic inspiration. Now, as many critics have remarked, the keynote of this experience seems to be uncertainty, because the mist is so thick that they can't see anything. In contrast to the clarity of vision that had characterized earlier moments on the journey, standing at the top of the highest mountain height did not bring the kind of poetic visions and revelations that Keats had perhaps expected, but instead they produced these strange feelings of confusion and an awareness of his precarious position. "Here are the craggy stones beneath my feet. Thus much I know, that a poor witless elf I tread on them, that all my eye doth meet is mist and crag, not only on this height, but in the world of thought and mental might." Far from feeling sure of his footing, Keats sees himself as a poor witless elf involved in a psychological struggle. But this struggle is productive for Keats because the epic fragment Hyperion that he went on to produce back at home in London as he nursed his dying brother that autumn was a powerful exploration of precisely the feelings of inadequacy, uncertainty, and being unable to see that he begins to articulate here. So as it transpires, standing on the highest height in Ben Nevis and not being able to see for the mist around them is actually as inspiring as those visions of the kind of Titans that he'd imagined at Fingals Cave. And his poem Hyperion focuses not on those who are ascendant, but the fallen, those who are suffering, Titans who have stood tall and ruled the natural elements are now struggling to find a way forward after losing their immortality and their place in the world. And implicitly then, and this is my conclusion, insight and understanding seem to come through an acceptance of one's fragility and weakness for Keats. So his character Oceanus in Hyperion suggests that the Titans have fallen by course of nature's law and been displaced by those who are born of them and fated to excel them, so that the golden age of the Olympians is in some sense part of the Titan legacy too. Thus, the intricate poetic genealogy that emerges over the course of Keats's walking tour and the twin strands of vision and mental struggle that he experiences directly informed his creation of a poem that Byron considered as securing Keats's own legacy. It is a fine monument and will keep his name. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Meiko. That was fabulous. Would anybody like to ask a question or any comments for Meiko? While you're thinking about that, could I just ask you how precisely worked out was his itinerary in advance? Was there any elements of serendipity as he travelled?
Yes, I think there is. Isn't it? That's a really interesting question, because I think they had clearly planned it out quite carefully, and there are certain places that he and Brown really want to go to. So they've kind of planned their route, but there's also room for some flexibility in there as well. And when they go to Northern Ireland, they're actually planning to go to the Giant's Causeway. I think part of the reason that Fingals Cave made such an impression on him is because he's seen nothing like that before, which perhaps if he'd made it to the Giant's Causeway, he would have had a sort of similar experience. So the journey does change kind of en route. And there's quite a funny moment where Brown and Keats are expecting to be able to stay at an inn, because I think it's called something like, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like Traveller's Rest or Rest and Be Thankful. Yeah, Rest and Be Thankful, I think is what it's called. And they think that refers to an inn, that it's the name of a place where they can stay. And it turns out to be this stone that just marks a point on the journey. So they're really gutted when they realise that they can't get any refreshment and rest after all. So yeah, it does change en route.
Thank you.
There's some room for spontaneity. I'm happy to take any other questions if anyone wants to ask. Jenny, do you want to unmute yourself?
Keats was clearly interested in politics. Did he play a part in the anti-slavery movement at all?
Oh, that's a great question. No, he doesn't play a part in the anti-slavery movement as far as I know, but yes, you're right, he is very interested in politics, and he's, in fact, part of the sort of critics' branding of him as a Cockney poet is also to do with his radical politics. And he's perceived as a sort of dangerous poet because he's kind of propagating and disseminating these wicked ideas about equality and such controversial things. So he's definitely perceived as a sort of politically radical poet, as well as being one. But he's not officially involved in any campaigns as far as I'm aware.
Thank you.
Okay. But yes, I think I don't know, I think today sometimes there's an idea of Keats as very delicate and, him sort of lying in Hampstead and being sort of ill with tuberculosis and sort of, you know, being inspired and writing poems and sitting in the garden listening to a nightingale and that kind of thing. But there's clearly quite a a physically robust Keats as well, who does all this journeying and yeah, has some very strong reactions to seeing some of these places and who gives voice to his disappointment and political disillusionment and things as well. So I think the journey north does open up a different idea of Keats.
So was he financially secure? I mean, money wasn't a problem for him, was it? In terms of being able to travel as much as he liked, essentially.
Money is actually a worry for Keats pretty much all his life. I mean, his short life, sadly, very tragic, tragically short. But yes, he's sort of, I suppose, strictly speaking, he's lower middle class. So he's nothing like a sort of, you know, he's not a labouring class poet like Robert Burns is. And he has got, unknown to him actually, he did have an inheritance. Like his mother had and grandmother had actually put away some money for him, his grandmother I think, but he can't get at it and he doesn't know it's there. So it's awful actually that Keats and his brothers are sort of always worrying about money, and so he always has that sort of sense of precarity. And so the journey with Brown is one where they are trying to save money along the way, and they trying to do it on foot as much as possible. They do get a coach from, you know, at certain points, but yeah, they're trying to travel on the cheap really. and actually when they go to Northern Ireland, they lose a rucksack actually that has some resources in it, so their funds are even sort of more depleted than they were expecting. Yeah. But yes, so again, I find that a lot of people think that because Keats lived in Hampstead, which we now know is an incredibly expensive area in London, that there's, you know, we could easily have this idea of him as actually being much more well-to-do than he was.
Well, if nobody has any other questions or comments, I'd just like to thank Meiko again for a fascinating talk tonight. Really very interesting indeed, and I think it all makes us want to go walking, perhaps not at 4 a.m, but to explore romantic scenery. So thank you again, and I hope that one day you'll be able to come into Lit and Phil and give a talk to an audience right in front of you in person. That would be great. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank our audience tonight. Thank you for joining us. It's much appreciated. And of course, this lecture is a free event. If you've already donated to Lit and Phil to help us continue our work, thank you very much indeed. If you haven't and you'd like to, you can find details of how to do that on our website or on our YouTube channel. But anyway, thank you again, and I shall draw the evening to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Okay.